more and more restricted, and eventually I was deprived of my home, and I spent my time in 3 different camps. The third chapter I've called The Liberation, the 9th of May, 1945. That was a day that we longed for, prayed for, hoped for, and then suddenly, there it was. We were, in fact, the very last place to be liberated when World War II came to an end. So we had to see it right the way through to the bitter end. And finally, a chapter which I probably won't have time to go into tonight, which is called The Rehabilitation. That's from June 1945, when I came to England in a very unusual way. I was unceremoniously dumped on the runway at Croydon Airport, which was then the Heathrow of London, with my mother and my 2 brothers, having been flown from the Czech Republic by 2 wonderful RAF pilots of Transport Command, who flew us completely and illegally, I might add, via Paris and dumped us on the runway at Croydon. So I'm an illegal immigrant, and they're yet to find that out. But as we're all in the EU, no doubt I shall be all right. So just something about my family first. My father was born in the city of Zwolle, where his father was an eminent surgeon and one of the great pioneers of the appendix operation. At the beginning of the 20th century, if you got appendicitis, that was extremely dangerous. And for those of you who are historians will well know that King Edward VII's coronation was really on a knife edge because he had appendicitis, but he got through. His mother, my father's mother, was the very first woman to serve on the town council of the city of Zwolle, where they lived. They had 4 children, of which my father was the youngest and the only son. He was bright, intelligent, clever, sporty, and after he'd finished his secondary school, he went to the sort of Oxbridge of the Netherlands, the University of Leiden, where he read law, graduated with a first-class honours degree, went on to do a doctorate, and during his time at the university, he co-authored a book about the history of the Students' Union of that university, and the university goes back to the 16th century, so this was a massive work. The other author, by the way, was a great leader of the Dutch resistance. After he'd finished, oh yes, he also rowed for the university and was captain of the university hockey club. And in the 1928 Olympic Games, which were held in Amsterdam, he was one of the umpires for the tournament, and then also, in fact, wrote a book about the laws and the tactics of hockey for the Dutch Hockey Association. And hockey was one of the major sports played in the country at that time. After he'd finished his studies, he went into practice as a lawyer, and became very, very much in demand, very competent. As Hitler took control in Germany, German Jews were under terrible pressure. Many of them fled as refugees into Holland. And when he annexed Austria, many of the Austrian Jews also fled into Holland, because remember, Holland was neutral in World War I. And my father was asked to lead a welfare organisation that was funded by the Dutch government to help these people when they arrived in Holland, to find somewhere for them to live and work and that sort of thing. And he headed that welfare organisation. And when the Germans invaded Holland with the occupation, that organisation was forced into the Jewish Council. And although my father didn't want to be a member of the Jewish Council, that's where he ended up. Whilst he was there, he helped Jews find hiding places. We even actually hid Jews in our house from time to time. He was a link in an organisation that helped Jews wait to have false papers made for them, and then they would come to my father's office for legal advice, where they would pick up these papers, which would get them through Holland, Belgium and France, and by some alpine guard over the top, by some mountain track over the top of the Alps into the safety of neutral Switzerland. He was betrayed, and having gone from his house one morning in December 1942 to go to work, and of course by that time Jews weren't even allowed to use public transport. He had to walk to work. And he was arrested in the office at 11 o'clock that morning and taken to a prison, a place called Amersfoort. There he was tortured, brutally tortured. From there he was taken to the Chancery camp of Westerbork, where the main population of Jews went before they were shipped off into the unknown, into the east. And very soon after he arrived there, and he arrived there in terrible physical condition. We know this from eyewitness accounts. He could hardly walk, his face was badly swollen, his teeth had been knocked out. And he was taken to Auschwitz, where he was murdered on and around the 21st of January 1943 in the gas chambers there. Holocaust Memorial Day is very important for me because it's so close to the 27th of January, to the murder of this wonderful man who had done a huge amount of really good work in the young life that he held. He was only, as I said, only 39 years old. He was one of the founder members in Holland of in this country we call Legal Aid. A group of lawyers set up an organization in Amsterdam to help the poor of Amsterdam to get legal redress through the courts, for which they had no hope of ever being able to pay, and therefore being denied that sort of access. He made certain that they could get this legal advice. My mother also was an unbelievable woman. I suppose I ought to talk to her about what happened, how she came about. She was born in Eastbourne on the south coast. Her parents were both professional musicians who came from Holland to England to work here at the beginning, or just before the 20th century, 1898, somewhere around about that time. And my mother was, as I said, born in Eastbourne. She had an elder and a younger sister. Her parents were at that time, my grandfather was the violinist conductor of what was called the Palm Court Orchestra of the Grand Hotel at Eastbourne, which some of the older people here may well remember, as it used to broadcast on the radio for quite a long time. My grandmother, again a bit of a pioneer, she was actually the very first woman in this country to set up an all-professional female orchestra. It was called the Windsor Ladies Orchestra in 1899, followed by the Scottish Ladies Orchestra. And they're all, I've got photographs of them all in kilts and funny-looking hats. And when my grandfather's playing days were over, he went into music publishing, and of course in those days music publishing was sheet music, there were no records or anything like that. And he was responsible for many of those World War I songs, things like Roll Out the Barrel, Pack Up Your Troubles in Your Old Kit Bag, and for World War II songs like Now Is the Hour, When We Must Say Goodbye. We'll get to that later, after a couple of hours. He became infamous actually because he produced a piece of music which became so popular, a #1 hit. But it was so easy to play, the lyrics were dead easy, you didn't need any music. So you just played by ear. So it was a total disaster as far as the company was concerned. And yet it's been a #1 hit ever since. What is it?
Chopsticks. Chopsticks.
No.
Happy birthday.
Yeah, that's right. Happy birthday. So happy birthday to anybody whose birthday it is here today. My mother wasn't an academic, like my father, and when she finished her schooling, they decided to send her to Amsterdam to learn how to cook, keep house, and learn to iron men's shirts, so that when she got married, she could keep her man in the style and comfort he ought to be kept in. When I say that to the youngsters today, there's horror on their faces. But that's what it was in those days, late 20s, early 30s. And while she was there, she met my father, they fell in love, and they got married. And I can't show you the photograph of this very happy day when they got married. But I just want to briefly talk about some of the people that would have been on this photograph, which you would have seen on this screen if it had been there. I can actually just show you like this so you can see. On this photograph there is my father's mother, shrouded in a sort of dark top. She was quite old when they got married in 1931. And she died in 1939, mercifully before the Germans invaded Holland. Her younger sister's on this photograph, who again missed the war completely, having been born in Eastbourne, went to live in New York. Missed it completely. One of the bridesmaids was my father's niece, my cousin in fact. although we weren't even a twinkle in my parents' eye at that time. She happened to be the eldest daughter of my father's eldest sister. And of course the sisters got married younger, and of course he was being the youngest, he got married older, so it was quite a big age difference. In fact, she was almost the same age as my mother. And we were secular Jews, we weren't at all religious. We were basically Dutch. Yes, my father was interested in Jewish organizations, but we didn't go to the synagogue, we didn't eat kosher food or anything like that. We were just basically did what most people do these days anyway, live secularly, I suppose you'd call it. And this cousin of mine, when she got married, she married a non-Jew. And so when the Germans invaded Holland, she was absolutely petrified what might happen to her. So she went into hiding, but she went into hiding in her own home. Just disappeared from view. And everything that she needed was brought in by her husband and a trusted family friend. It was far too dangerous to let anybody in, because neighbours around were quite happy to shock you to the German authorities. And during that time when she was hidden in her own home, she gave birth to 2 sons, all alone. No doctor, no midwife. Both these births were successful, and in fact after the war she gave birth to yet a 3rd son, and she lived to be well into her 90s before she died a few years back. Another bridesmaid on that photograph is a little girl called Jetteke, who was just 15 at the time the Germans invaded Holland, and she was also hidden. But again, she was hidden in a completely different way. She was hidden by the Dutch resistance. They would find a house where non-Jews lived who were prepared to hide a Jew in their home. Now this was a very, very dangerous thing to do, because if you were caught hiding Jews in your house, you were either imprisoned, or you were sent off to the camps, or you were even shot. And so people who did this were incredibly brave. And bearing in mind that all around you there are people who were quite happy to shop you to the German authorities because you got paid for that, 30 quid in today's money per Jew. So it was quite a sort of, lucrative thing for those who were willing to do that sort of thing. So she'd be hidden in this house, and then when the Dutch resistance heard that she'd been betrayed and the Germans were coming to raid that house, they get there before the Germans and whip her out. Could be any time during the day or night, and put her into another safe house. And when the same thing happened again, they'd take her out again and put her into another. And she spent those war years going from one house to another, and remained one step ahead of the Germans, and is still alive today, aged 88. An interesting thing about her was, when she was at school, her best friend in her class was a girl called Margot Frank. And for those of you who've read the Diary of Anne Frank will know that Margot was Anne's elder sister. Margot she did write a diary, but it was never found. Margot is unknown compared with her younger sister Anne, but Margot was the one who had that tremendous strength and personality that kept all those 3 families who were living, hiding in that tiny little place above the shop, under control. Whenever there was trouble, she would pour oil on troubled waters, calm them all down, particularly between her younger sister Anne and the dentist, Fritz Pfeiffer, who was very much a sort of Victorian character. Children should be seen and not heard. And they were both, of course, wanting to share the desk, he to do his dental studies and Anne to do her diary. So there was no love lost between those two. And in fact, in her diary, she calls him Albert Dussel. And Dussel is Dutch for stupid. So you can see those two never hit it off. But it was always Margot who quieted them all down. And it is no surprise to me that sort of rather sad end of their lives. They're taken from Westerbork at the time when I was there as well. They were taken to Auschwitz, and then from Auschwitz these 2 were taken to Belsen, and about a week before the British liberated Belsen, Margot died of typhus. And then Anne followed very soon after that. I think once Margot had gone, I think that strength, that rock of the elder sister, she just gave up and died as well. It was a rather tragic thing. And the only other person, a little boy in a sailor suit on that photograph, who in fact was 19, her elder brother Leo, he was very active in the Dutch resistance group, very active in blowing up bridges, derailing trains carrying German armaments. And on one occasion they ambushed a car carrying a much hated and feared SS general, a chap called General Seifert. And in the ensuing battle that took place, they assassinated this guy and they got away. But later on he was caught and he was executed in Bloemendaal in 1943. But after the war he was regarded as one of the great heroes of the Dutch resistance, and there are several streets and squares named after him throughout the land. So he's been much recognised in what he did. We had a very happy, as I said, a very happy childhood, and then the Germans invade Holland, and of course the first thing they want to do is, where are the Jews? Where are the Jews living? And I'm afraid the Dutch civil service, much like the British civil service did when the Labour government were turfed out at the last general election and the coalition came in, the civil service just carries on. It's got its job to do, it has different masters, different priorities, different things it has to do, but it just carries on. Well, the Dutch civil service behaved in exactly the same way. The Germans wanted to know where the Jews were, we'll let you know where the Jews were. Unlike the Danish civil service, they prevaricated, they were obstructive towards the German occupying forces. Result? Between these two nations, very, very similar in outlook, less than 1% of Danish Jews lost their lives in the Holocaust. Over 75% of Dutch Jews lost their lives in the Holocaust. Totally different, completely different. And why? Several books have been written about that particular thing. Anyway, Jews had married non-Jews, and so their children were half-Jews. And you remember, these Nazis, they were fanatical about this race thing. Were those half-Jews more Jewish if their mother was Jewish and their father wasn't? And what happened if that half-Jew married another half-Jew? What about their children? It all became very complicated. And so they had these Nuremberg laws which they would apply to each person to find out exactly how Jewish a Jew was. So if you had 4 grandparents who were Jewish, then you were immediately, labelled as one of these subhuman species. But if you only had 2 grandparents, well, they gave you a bit of a chance. No doubt if the Germans had remained longer, they would have all gone too. And if you had 1 Jewish grandparent, you were still very much in danger. But that's how it worked there. And if you were a Jew, classified in November 1940, if you were a Jew, they just threw you out if you worked in the civil service. So if you were a librarian or a university lecturer or a park keeper or anything like that, you're out. And the dole in those days was precious little, but hardly any money at all. So these people tried to get work as handymen, window cleaners, gardeners, anything, in order to earn a crust working for non-Jewish people. In January 1941, identity cards were introduced. Every adult, should I say, was given an identity card. Now, if you were Catholic or Protestant, that didn't show on your identity card, but if you were a Jew, that certainly did. And the identity card, which I can't show you, is in actual fact on display in the Imperial War Museum in London at the moment. And so if you were stopped in the street by an official, you always had to show your identity card, so they would immediately know if you were Jewish or not. In February 1941, the Germans set up this organisation called the Jewish Council, and it was their job to inform the Jewish population of the Netherlands what they were now not allowed to do anymore. Very slowly and subtly, the Germans started to turn the screw, restricting what Jews could not do anymore. In September 1941, a notice appeared on the gate post of the park at the end of the street where I lived, and it said, "Verboten für Juden," forbidden for Jews. And suddenly, I wasn't allowed to go in there to play. And I found it very difficult to understand why. I hadn't vandalised anything. My friends, who weren't Jews, whatever that meant, could go in to play, and I wasn't. Benches in the street had written on it, "Für Juden verboten." So the elderly had nowhere to sit. And all these restrictions started to come in. We were banned from going to the zoos, cafes, restaurants, hotels, theatres, concerts, libraries, museums, sports events. So slowly but surely, we've been more and more isolated. In January 1942, Jews living in Holland were forced to leave their house and move into the city of Amsterdam, if they weren't living there before. And it was in that very same month, in January 1942, a very, very sinister conference took place in a place called Wannsee, which is near Berlin. It was known as the Wannsee Conference. And here the hierarchy of the Nazi authorities worked out coolly, calmly, collectively, and by God, efficiently, how they were going to murder every single Jew living in Europe. And they murdered 6 million of my people. 6 million. I can see it going around in your heads. The mathematical ones of you, 6,000,000, perhaps. The non-mathematical one of you, SIX, MILLION. It's a number which is almost too hard to believe. And I want to try and put that into some sort of perspective. A couple of examples. First of all, this is a sheet of stars which came out of Czechoslovakia with the word Jude, which is German for Jew, written on it. Each one of these stars represents the murder of 95,000 Jews. You try and get 95,000 pencil dots or even pixels in there, you'd be hard put to it. Or as I put to the kids when I talk in schools, I take them back to the Olympic Games. You know, we all watched them no doubt on television. You saw the television cameras going around and all you could see were faces, just as I see faces here. And every now and then they'd hone in on one because his or her face was painted in the national colours of the country that they were supporting, or an athlete, or whatever it was, and then they would hone in on another person who had different paintings or shirts or t-shirts, whatever they were wearing, supporting yet another country. And you began to realise that every single person in that stadium had hopes, ambitions, fears, each one. Now, let me take you to the last night of the Olympic Games, on that Saturday night. The stadium is completely full. Then all the athletes march in, and all the helpers, and all the officials. They're all in the centre bit there. You now have 95,000 people approximately in the stadium. Now, if just like at Centre Court in Wimbledon, they could close the roof over the whole of that stadium and leave a little hole at the top, through which some nasty little Nazi poured in a canister of Zyklon B. And within 5 or 10 minutes, every single person in that stadium is writhing in agony and dying. And when they're all dead, the whole lot are pushed out. Then on Sunday night, they do the whole thing again. And again on Monday night, and on Tuesday night, and on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday night. In fact, every night of that week, every week of that month, for more than 3 months, then you come to the murder of 6 million of my people. I hope that sort of puts it a bit into perspective of the huge amount that was. Let's get back to Holland. In May 1942, Jews had to hand over their bank accounts, their stocks, their shares. They all had to go into a special bank the Germans set up called the Lippmann Rosenthal Bank. And that, of course, was all being siphoned off to the German Reich. In June, if you owned a shop, that became illegal. You had to hand it over to a non-Jew. A curfew was imposed. You were not allowed to go out after 8 o'clock at night. It was illegal to own a car. Not that many people had cars in those days, or a bike. You were banned from using public transport, so the only way you're going to get around was on your own 2 feet. In July, jewellery and antiques were confiscated. Shopping hours were now restricted between the hours of 3 and 5. You were not allowed to go into non-Jewish homes, though I must say I can't really recall that. I'm sure I still did. And in that same month, just like Margot Frank, a letter would drop through the letterbox inviting you to be resettled in the East. So that's the sort of thing that was going on. Turn over a few pages here. There were so many restrictions of the things. And one of the things, of course, was that the Germans couldn't recognise what a Jew looked like in the street. They might all look like Shylock in The Merchant of Venice, or Fagin in Oliver. They didn't all have big noses and wander around counting money. They were just like anybody else. Some are tall, some are short, some are fat, some are thin. I was a typical little Dutch boy with blonde hair, blue eyes, and in the winter I wore clogs just like all my friends down the street did. I looked no different. So the Germans had to invent some system whereby they had to mark the Jew, and they did this by taking the holiest emblem of the Jewish faith, the Star of David. And every Jew over the age of 5 had to wear that star. Here's my star, with the word Jood, which is Dutch for Jew, still has the bits of cotton attached to it, where it was taken off my clothing at the end of the war, and everybody had to wear that star. Now, if you were caught not wearing that star, and you could be trying to beat the curfew, or anything that you weren't supposed to be doing as a Jew, you were taken to a place not very far from where we lived, and there you were lined up against the wall, and you were shot through the head. And I can clearly remember hearing a sort of bang, bang, bang as another group of Jews had been caught and had been summarily executed. Today, a memorial stands in that place there, and in fact, the name of the street has been changed. By that time, I'd started in my little local primary school, which in fact was the very first primary school that was built that looked like what primary schools look like today. It was the very first one in Europe. It was called the Openluchtschool, the open air school. Nice, bright classrooms, beach-coloured desks in a sort of semicircle around the teacher. It was all very bright and airy and sweet, and completely different. And suddenly I was taken away from that school, and I was put into this rather dark and dingy Victorian school where all the desks were one behind the other, the windows were high up, the walls were painted chocolate brown. And the strange thing was, probably like we all did when we were at school, we used to sit next to the same person in class, and then suddenly that person next to you disappeared. No, he wasn't sick. He'd been invited to be resettled in the East. Or if he was really unlucky, he'd just been picked up. Or if he was lucky, he'd gone into hiding. To the person on my right, my friend would disappear. And I felt a bit, if you can imagine, like a pebble with all my classmates. Pebbles in the bottom of the river Chess, why not? And as the river starts to flow faster, there's been plenty of that these days, pebbles all around you started to roll away as the stream increased in speed, and other pebbles took their place. And then they rolled away, and other pebbles took their place. And then one, of course, the stream then went so fast that my pebble rolled away. When my father was arrested in the office, my mother and her 3 young sons disappeared. We went into hiding. Nobody came to the house. We returned there. Now my mum was beginning to show some of her bravery and ingenuity. She found out the prison where he was in Amersfoort there. She changed places with one of the men and disguised as a man went in there scrubbing floors, briefly seeing my father on 2 or 3 occasions before he completely disappeared. We had no money coming in. She set herself up as a barber, cutting Jewish men's hair, because Jewish men weren't allowed to go to non-Jewish barbers to get their hair cut. We lived in quite a large house. She opened part of this house as a school for Jewish children who'd been kicked out of the state system, had nowhere to be taught. And so she opened up various rooms so that they could have classes in our house. And in that way, she managed to keep body and soul together. Now, whilst my father was in prison, something happened which made a huge impression on my life. And that was 3 of my father's friends, Ernst Heldering, Jan Wiertsma and Arnold Dailly. These 3 men who were not Jewish, but they were fellow students when they were all at university. 2 of them were lawyers, one was a banker. These 3 men petitioned the German authorities for clemency for my father and wrote this great big long letter explaining all the good things that he had done in his life. This was an extremely dangerous thing to do because you were pleading for the life of a Jew who, according to the Germans, had betrayed, been a traitor because he hid Jews and helped Jews to escape. And these three men were all married men with children, responsibilities, yet they were prepared to stick their head over the parapet and plead for the life of a friend. And ever since I've known that, friendship has always been extremely important in my life. You know, there's a saying in English, I don't know if you know it, a friend in need is a friend indeed. Boy, how true that was. And although the Germans wouldn't relent as far as my father was concerned, they did allow his wife and 3 sons to be put on one of the many priority lists they had in Holland. In order to stop this mass panic among the Jewish population of Holland, they split Jews up into groupings, promising all sorts of things, which of course were never kept. And we were put on the Barneveld list, and on that list we were told we would not be sent abroad. we would be allowed to remain in Holland. We would not be sent to a work camp. We were after we'd been put on this list, it wasn't long after that my mother got notification that we were to be removed from our home, report to the station, to go to this place, Barneveld. It was a strange place. It was a castle which the Germans had requisitioned, and the people in it I can only describe as the sort of upper echelons of Dutch Jewish society who were there. Education. I remember at that time I was learning my multiplication tables. I was 7 years old, something like that. Yes, 7. You know, how did you learn your multiplication tables in those days? 1 7 to 7, 2 7 to 14, 3 7 to 21. We were being taught our multiplication tables by a professor of mathematics at one of the universities in Holland. And he couldn't understand why the hell we couldn't understand what he was talking about. And that's why we have primary school teachers or primary school children. So education was a bit of a farce there. But the one positive thing I did get out of there was a love of gardening. We were given a little plot which we had to weed and rake, and then I was given some seeds. I was lucky, I got some radish seeds and I planted a big SF in mine. And 10 days later, the wonders of nature, the green SF appeared in my little plot. My older brother, who had absolutely no interest in gardening whatsoever and never did anyway, he insisted on planting bananas. Needless to say, nothing ever did come. But that wonder of nature kept with me for the rest of my life. We were in Barneveld for 6 months when suddenly the German army stormed into the camp, told everybody, gave them 20 minutes to get ready. We were put on the train and we were sent to Westerbork, and that put the fear of God into everybody, because Westerbork was the main transit camp, and most of the Jews who had been picked up, arrested or whatever were sent there before they were forwarded on. Westerbork was in an isolated part of northeastern Holland, very sandy area. It had a great big moat around it of about 6 feet of water in it, with barbed wire fences, 6 foot high barbed wire fences in front and behind it, German watchtowers looking down at you. They were elevated watchtowers, and the guards had machine guns and searchlights looking down at you. The railway line came in. We were housed in one barrack number 85, 660 of us, all crammed into the barrack. The barrack itself, in front of the window would be a trestle table which held about 14 people, and you got to know those people quite well. That was your little social group. And in between the tables would be bunk beds 2 high, and as the pitch of the roof of the barrack went up, you got bunk beds 3 high going upwards. And I always remember, and we were there, washing facilities either end. Toilets was yet another barrack which had been constructed over a pit that was dug in the sand, again about 6 or 8 feet deep, over which they put planks of wood with holes in. Probably the biggest bog I've ever been in, some 70 seats, 2 rows of 35, back to back, men and women all in together. You can imagine how embarrassing that was for the women. And if you think you had such luxuries of toilet paper when you'd finished doing what you wanted to do, forget it. If you were lucky, you had a bit of newspaper, which you would then fold in half and use it again, and then fold it in half again until it became impossible to use it anymore. And so as a result, you know, the disease was rampant within the camp. The lice were everywhere, scarlet fever, dysentery, polio were all there. Yellow jaundice, it was all there in the camp. But it was in this camp where I learned to become streetwise. I remember very clearly one day I was on my own and I was miles away. I was thinking probably of what was going on before the war. And I was wandering along like this, on my own, and suddenly I looked up and I found myself right up against the perimeter wire, the 6 foot high perimeter wire, the moat, another perimeter wire, and up there was a guard looking down at me. And I looked round and I'd realised I'd walked away over no man's land, away from all the barracks, across this sort of bare area. And then I looked along the perimeter wire, and about 20 metres away were 2 German guards with an Alsatian dog. I froze. I looked at them, they looked at me, and then they just unleashed the dog. And this snarling Alsatian came bounding towards me. I remember putting my hands in front of my face, and I was bitten all over my arms, my chest, my thighs, and my legs, and I can still hear these German guards laughing at this bit of Jew baiting, this 8-year-old being mauled by this vicious Alsatian dog before they called it off. And I ran back to the barracks, I was bleeding from all these bite marks. So I learnt my lesson. After that, if ever I got to a corner, I'd look before I proceeded, and if I saw guards, I'd scarper, keep well away from guards. In this camp, we didn't starve. Food was monotonous. It was much the same day in, day out. We had no schooling at all. We made up an alphabet. We called it the Westerbork alphabet. It was really about how we saw life within the camp itself. But the thing about Westerbork was it was a transit camp. And every Tuesday, without fail, a train would leave. Mostly cattle trucks, anything between 900 and 2,500 souls would be on these cattle trucks going eastwards. And Adolf Eichmann, who was in charge of transportation, was very efficient. The trucks even had boards on them telling you exactly where they were going. Most of them were going to a place called Auschwitz. In fact, some of them had written on the Auschwitz-Westerbork with a shuttle service, with arrows. Sobibor was another favoured destination in Poland that everybody feared that they would go on. If you were lucky, you went to a place called Bergen-Belsen, which of course you know as Belsen, and the occasional transport that went to Theresienstadt, or Terezin as it was called in the Czech Republic, just north of Prague. So you could feel this fear building up at the weekend. On Monday a list to go up, pandemonium for all that were on it, sigh of relief for those who were off it. You had another week before the next transport would leave. And so this went on every week. And I remember on one occasion in this camp, on this table where we sat, these 14 people, that became our little social group really. We got to know those people very well. And on our table there were a couple in their 50s, an elderly couple, who were great Anglophiles, and they would reminisce with my mother about happy holidays they'd spent in England, and they would talk to my mother in English, which after all was my mother's mother tongue. And they were lovely, lovely couple, these two. In fact, we sort of adopted them as our sort of surrogate grandparents. And I remember on this particular occasion, it was in May 1944, I'd been outside somewhere, I'd walked into the barrack, and just as I got into the barrack, I heard this howl from the sky, a sort of and then a rat-tat-tat-tat-tat, and I looked up at the sort of, our pitched roof of our barrack, and I suddenly saw holes appearing in the roof, and I couldn't work out what was going on. And then there was another great howl, and more rat-tat-tat-tat, and more holes appearing in the roof, and screams and howls and yells and total panic within the barrack itself. And of course I was caught up in this panic, and I ran instinctively to my table, and I ran through this hail of bullets, and I wasn't even scratched. Nothing. It was almost as if there was this invisible shield all around me. And when I got to my table, there was this lovely, sweet, kind, gorgeous man slumped across, riddled with holes, and blood just pouring out of his body over the trestle table onto the floor. And it was the first time I came face with death, face to face. And it was the death of someone we'd come to love. And the greatest sadness of all was that this man, who loved England so much, was killed by British bullets fired from British aircraft. Yet another example when the intelligence goes all completely wrong and they get the wrong target. Our barrack was completely destroyed, and I found myself in barrack number 71. In fact, the whole of this Barneveld group was suddenly dispersed throughout the camp. So this feeling like a flock of sheep that you had, sort of mutual protection, was suddenly removed. We were all over the place. And I was in barrack number 71, where I met a man who was growing some tomatoes outside the barrack. He'd managed to get hold of some rotten tomatoes and been able to pick up the seeds and manage to germinate them. And I was fascinated by what he was doing because of my little experience with my little radishes in Barneveld. And I would help him water these tomato plants, pick out the side shoots so the tomato plants grow up nice and straight. I was his little helper. And one day he said to me, "Stephen, I'm afraid I've been put on transport. I'm going to Poland. Will you look after my tomato plants for me now?" And I felt so proud that he should ask me to look after his plants, which I did until it was my turn to go. But the strange thing is that today I grow tomatoes in my greenhouse in Chorleywood, where I live. And whenever I'm watering those tomato plants, I'm picking out the side shoots so the tomatoes grow up nice and straight. I see this man looking on. I don't know his name. I'm still watering his tomato plants, nearly 70 years on. I've not let him down. It's a very, very strange feeling that I have. Our barrack was completely destroyed, of course, and so we moved to another barrack where I met this man. Transports would leave us regularly, so people were desperate to get themselves jobs within the camp organisation so that they could stay in the camp. We need to keep that person because he's in charge of this or he works on there. And so bureaucracy was absolutely rampant, and there are several examples I've got of this sort of bureaucracy, which is no point in showing here. And then, with the Allies, this would mean in September 1944, with the Allies now in Arnhem, not that far away, Holland's a small country, suddenly a list went up and our names were on it. We were to go to this place called Theresienstadt, or Terezin. And I can remember my mother getting us ready for this journey. 3 pairs of socks, 3 pairs of pants, 2 pairs of trousers, 3 vests, 2 shirts, 2 pullovers. I was probably actually wearing all the clothes that I had. And we were allowed to take one little rucksack with us, which I had more clothes, no doubt, and a few personal things. And I remember going onto the ramp, the platform, and there was this row of cattle trucks, and there was this great big black rectangular hole. And I was pushed into it, more and more and more people. We were only, I was only sort of 9, so everybody was up there, and I was down there. And suddenly, when it was completely crammed full, I heard a sort of bang behind me, and suddenly, as they slid the door to, we were in total darkness. People started to scream and shout. And then, it's never completely dark. There's always stray light coming in. And we were fortunate, in our cattle truck, there were 4 tiny little windows in the 4 corners of our cattle truck. Then the train set off. Somebody in the cattle truck organised that all the rucksacks were piled into 2 corners. It meant that some people could sit. And I embarked upon a journey that I shall never ever forget. 39 hours in a cattle truck. No sleep, no food, no water. But what I remember most about this place was the stench that built up. If you could imagine a mixture of human sweat, of vomit, of urine, of feces, all mixed in together. You could hardly breathe. The oxygen levels were going down. We would clamber up the luggage to get to these little windows to get the air, and the adults, of course, would pull us back because we were taken away. And then suddenly this train stopped. There was this great it was dark outside. But what I remember most was this great waft of ice-cold air that came into the cattle truck. Suddenly we could breathe again. And it's a bit like when you dive into a swimming pool and you hit the bottom, rock bottom, you push yourself off, and you think it takes ages before you break the surface of the water and you can gasp for air again. But it was like that in ultra slow motion. And we'd arrived in Theresienstadt, Terezin as it was called, built in 1780 by Emperor Joseph II of the Austro-Hungarian Empire in memory of his mother, Maria Theresa. It was originally built to house 8,000 soldiers with their families. The Germans crammed 44,000 Jews in the same place. So it was grossly overcrowded. I remember very clearly there, we were put into a room in one of the big barracks there with my mother. No beds, of course, it was on the floor. And then, my mother, realizing that this was going to be a really dangerous place, she volunteered to go and work in the camp hospital laundry. Highly infectious, typhus epidemic had started, and all sorts of other diseases, scarlet fever, polio, everything was there, you name it, it was there. But if you worked in the camp hospital laundry, she had access to hot water. And when the authorities weren't looking, she would wash her children's clothes. Because the only way you can keep typhus at bay is to try and keep yourself as clean as possible. And in this camp we starved, and she would wash adults' clothes and barter that for food. We were soon taken away from the Hamburger barracks where my mother was and put into a children's home. There we played among our peers, we made up games. Stamp collecting was a great thing in those days. We collected razor blades, particularly Gillette razor blades. And it had a sort of lithograph of Mr. Gillette and his signature on it like that. But when there was a change in the print run, the shading changed slightly. And so this is how we got our swaps, and this is how we made up our collection. There was a Czech one as well, which was most uninteresting. It didn't really have anything on it much at all. We played football using buttons, large buttons from coats and things as the players, shirt buttons as the ball. We played cards, make a pack of 52 cards. The backs were all multi-faceted. You might even have to change the 5 of diamonds into a 4 of diamonds and the jack of spades into a king of spades. But 52 cards we would get, so we would play. We played some chess. We managed to get hold of some chess pieces. We made up our own chess boards. And we made torches. We found out where the Germans were throwing away their old, discarded, worn-out batteries. And we managed to get hold of some torch bulbs and some wire. And we found that if you take the wire and you wind it around the screw bit of your bulb, and then you put the other end of the bulb on one terminal of the battery, and the other end of the wire on another terminal of the battery, your little bulb would shine. But of course, these batteries was exhausted. So how did we regenerate them? We put them between our thighs at night when we went to sleep, and the warmth of our bodies during the night would regenerate these batteries sufficiently so when it got dark the following night, and remember there's no electricity in these places, when it got dark the following night we would get our little torches out, we'd put them, get them lit again. And it was like a bright star in the sky when these little bulbs were on, and you have no idea how comforting that is. But of course it didn't stay on for very long because the batteries couldn't hold the charge for long, and then they would start to get dimmer and dimmer, and I always remember then eventually you were left with a little red filament on the bottom, and then you were back into the reality of really where you were. But these are the sort of things that we did in order to pass the time of day. In transport, in Theresienstadt, we starved. Food was minimal. Your stomach normally looks like a sort of rugby football. Ours became sort of concave, like a sort of crescent moon. You longed for food, because food is the one thing that you always want. And that, when you have toothache, you get this toothache inside your stomach, and it's always there, it never goes away. Some people try to con the brain into believing that they were eating something by sucking the buttons on their coats and jackets or whatever, in order to con the brain to believe that they're actually eating something. Transports went to the east, not quite as regularly as I remember in Westerbork, but they did go. And I remember on one occasion the Germans came to our children's home, and they had a plan about who they would take. And I witnessed this with my own eyes. They didn't want me, but if you two, say, a brother and sister, they would take you and leave you behind. If there were 2 sisters, they'd take one and leave the other behind. 2 brothers, same thing. And I witnessed this howling, this screaming that went on between these children. Please, let me stay with him. Or, let me go with her. Nein, du raus schnell, would be the answer from the guards. And these kids screaming and yelling would be taken away, and the others sobbing, left behind. The ones going away, going to Auschwitz to their virtual certain deaths. The ones remaining behind to a very uncertain future. And the tragedy was that was probably the last link that they had in their families. Their mother and their father, long gone, brothers and sisters also gone. All these children had left for one another. And the Germans deliberately broke that last link. It's something that I shall never ever forget. This utter screaming and howling of these children that went on there. It said food was very, very scarce. You got used to get one meal in the evening or late afternoon. It consisted of a bowl of watery soup. If you were lucky, it had 2 or 3 pieces of rye in it. If you were really lucky, it had a potato peel or a cabbage, a bit of a cabbage leaf in it. 1 or sometimes 2 slices of this black bitter bread which they had there, and a mug of some black stuff which they called coffee. To drink anything was better than not drinking anything at all. Attached to the camp was a place called the Little Fortress, with the now infamous Arbeit macht frei written on it. There people were taken and tortured and beaten. Theresienstadt was a camp that contained what I can only describe as the intelligentsia of Europe. You had musicians, composers, actors, all sorts of people.